It's time for the 1430 Connection on 1430 WNAV and 99.9 FM, spotlighting news, newsmakers, and important community issues. Now, with this week's edition of the 1430 Connection, here is WNAV news anchor Donna Cole.
Welcome to the 1430 Connection. I'm Donna Cole. In the studio with me today is Jim Bass. He's the Coastal Resilience Manager for the Easton-based Eastern Shore Land Conservancy. Jim, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Donna.
Your organization, the tagline is committed to preserving and sustaining the vibrant communities of the Eastern Shore and the lands and waters that connect them. You recently published a editorial. That's what caught my interest. The reason for the editorial is you held your Party to Preserve, where you discussed the Delmarva Oasis. So we're going to talk about the Delmarva Oasis. But on the weekend that you held the Party to Preserve, what happened?
There was pretty dramatic flooding around the Eastern Shore and around the region. It prevented some of our guests from attending Party to Preserve with us, and there were business impacts and tourism impacts all over the Chesapeake region, which were dramatic to say the least. Yeah,
we saw some of the photos from a wedding went viral. A wedding in
Ken Island.
Yeah, as it happens, a journalist that we know and love that does not work for us, but his daughter was getting married. Yes.
Yes.
These flood situations aren't new. Tell us what happened.
Sure. So it was a full moon, or closely approaching full moon. There's a tropical storm way out in the Atlantic, but strong enough to cause some tidal issues in terms of tides being a little bit higher than normal and issues with the tide receding back out into the bay. So all of it sort of being a perfect storm, so to speak, of tidal issues that just presented tons and tons and tons of water without a single raindrop having fallen.
And this is not new, but we're seeing this more frequently, yes?
We are.
And the reason for that is?
Climate change.
And climate change is something that you were talking about with the Party to Preserve, and it's something that you're talking about with Delmarva Oasis, which I have in your editorial, quote, an initiative to protect 50% of the Delmarva Peninsula we love and call home by the year 2030, protecting land, specifically placing low-lying and waterfront properties in easements to limit future development is critical to the future of Delmarva as flooding episodes such as this increase in frequency and severity. Yes?
Yes. Delmarva Oasis is not just about coastal resilience. It's not just about a strategy to protect against climate change and sea level rise, but climate protection is definitely one of the benefits of this land preservation initiative by ESLC and our partners.
Okay, there are people that are reluctant to accept this, that they're in disbelief that climate change is happening. How do you address that?
At the end of the day, I don't really have strong feelings about whether you believe in climate change or not, because your belief doesn't dictate whether climate change or sea level rise is going to present an issue. It's going to.
Is already.
Is already, absolutely. One of the things that we hear commonly is, how can you be so sure that this is a thing that's happening or something that we need to plan for the future? The models are always changing. Like, yeah, the models are changing, absolutely. And you know what? They're getting worse every single time they run new models. And every time a new report comes out, it's always worse. So yeah, I hope that I wake up one day and find out that all of the models are wrong and that I've put myself out of the job. But I'm not going to wager a whole lot of money on that situation.
We've already seen people having to move on the shore, yes?
Yes.
We've already seen land gobbled up by water on the shore. And if there's any doubters with this, take a ride over to Dorchester, anywhere in Dorchester County along the water, you'll see it. You'll see water in low-lying areas even when there hasn't been any rain, yes? Again, a quote from your editorial. To build this Delmarva Oasis in the face of climate change and sea level rise, ESLC is engaging government partners at the local and state level to bring funding and resources to the region, which will result in safe, adaptive, and resilient communities now and the future. It sounds like a no-brainer.
I like to think so.
How much is this going to take?
It's a lot of effort, certainly. So in terms of land protection by the numbers, our goal is 50% of the Delmarva Peninsula being protected. And that's placed in conservation easement, working farms, state parks, just general protected lands. All of these things count towards that 50% goal. Currently, Maryland is at about 29%. Virginia is a little bit ahead of us. Virginia is at about 39%, and Delaware is at about 27%. So all total, we're at about 30% protection for the whole Delmarva Peninsula. So we're definitely reaching our goal. But in the next 10 years or so, we really need to ramp up those efforts to protect land, get those easements on, make sure that we're restricting development to preserve natural functions and natural lands, and make this a viable place for people to live for generations in the future.
It sounds like a no-brainer. We're going to talk about what easements are, what that means for those that are not aware. We'll be right back on the 1430 Connection. Welcome back to the 1430 Connection. I'm Donna Cole. In the studio with me is Jim Bass. He's the Coastal Resilience Manager for the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy. It's an Easton-based nonprofit committed to preserving and sustaining the vibrant communities of the Eastern Shore and the lands and waters that connect them. We're talking about easements, trying to get to a 50% level for this Delmarva Oasis, an initiative to protect 50% of the Delmarva Peninsula. Easements. Easements are what?
Great question. Conservation easement is a legal mechanism to protect a piece of property or remove certain rights from a piece of property.
So generally, is it somebody will this put this in their will?
That's correct.
Or can it happen immediately, or both?
Both. Yeah, you can set it up either immediately or at some point in the future.
So a person that and you're talking about mostly waterfront property, coastal property?
Not necessarily. We have a lot of inland farm property as well.
You have a piece of property, you know that you want to preserve it for future generations. This is the way you do it. And if somebody has a farm, for instance, are they still allowed to farm it when there's an easement on it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not trying to, for the most part, we're not trying to take productive agricultural land out of production. And we're not trying to say that you can't continue to enjoy the property that you own in the way that you enjoy having your property.
But once you're gone, once the future generations might be gone, that property may then turn into a parkland or something else, right?
It might, depending on how you structure the easement. I think that a general conservation easement will allow a certain number of structures to remain on the property or to be built on the property in the future. It will allow certain uses in terms of agricultural practices or hunting or however you want to interact with the land. So there are plenty of allowances that can be made. It's not like you have to pack up and get off the property immediately. But the main purpose is to restrict future development for, say, neighborhoods or shopping malls or anything like that.
And benefits as far as tax ramifications go?
It varies depending on the value of the property, the size of the property, a number of factors. But yeah, there are tax benefits both immediately and into the future.
So if you're listening to this now and you want to look further into conservation easement on your property on the Eastern Shore, get a hold of the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy through an email or through the website, which is?
ESLC.org.
Okay, there you go.
And I do want to say that we cover Cecil County down through Dorchester County, but the Lower Shore Land Trust covers Worcester, Wycomico, and Somerset counties, and there are other land trusts doing similar work throughout the state of Maryland.
All right. Now, people that are listening to this that might not have massive amounts of land to put into conservation easement, if they have an acre, if they have 200 acres, are you looking for anybody or are you looking for those 200 acres?
That depends on the organization. ESLC has certain requirements that you have to have a minimum amount of land for us to consider working with a property owner. But again, it varies from organization to organization.
What's the minimum for you?
Generally speaking, it's 50 acres.
Okay.
There have been exceptions made in the past. Yeah, so it doesn't hurt to reach out and start the process of inquiry.
Okay. For those that don't have the minimum amount of acres, but do want to help with the resiliency going forward on the Eastern Shore and ensuring that it will still be around in 50, 100, 150 years, what are some little things that people can do? Should they be putting in riprap? Should they be putting in, what should they be doing and not be doing?
We like to see natural solutions wherever feasible and applicable. We understand that that's not always going to be realistic. We have a lot of riprap, a lot of armored bulkheads on the Eastern Shore, and that does provide a level of protection for property owners. And it's not always going to make sense for somebody to pull out their riprap and install living shoreline across their entire property.
But if they can, is a living shoreline the way to go?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. What we like to see is we want to see nature be allowed to do what nature is going to do. And natural flood protection is the best way to go about protecting your property and yourself against flooding. Whether that's tidal flooding today or extreme precipitation-induced flooding, or whether that's the threat of sea level rise into the future.
Okay, frag, one of my favorite subjects. Let it go or try to eradicate it? Again,
speaking from an idealist perspective, we would like to get rid of phragmites and allow native species to grow and to thrive. That's not always necessarily going to be feasible. And so I personally would rather have protection via frag rather than no protection at all.
Okay. We're going to take another short break. We'll be right back on the 1430 Connection. Welcome back to the 1430 Connection. I'm Donna Cole. In the studio with me is Jim Bass, Eastern Shore Land Conservancy's Coastal Resilience Manager. He is concerned with the resilience of the Eastern Shore of Maryland, or at least the many counties up on the upper portion of the Eastern Shore. Thriving, not simply surviving in the Delmarva Oasis. That's what you called your editorial. What else would you like to see happen in addition to people putting into conservation easements their larger pieces of property?
Well, one of the pieces about thriving, not just surviving, is respecting the local economy. And so much of the Eastern Shore is dependent on productive agriculture. And as we see saltwater encroaching on productive ag land, farmers are starting to lose that productive acreage. And what we don't want to see is farmers who have to get rid of their farms entirely. We would like to work with farmers today to start putting in barriers and thinking about adaptation strategies that will help them continue to be financially resilient today and in the future.
And what are some of those ways of help?
So physically protecting land would be thinking about taking some of the property out of production. That could be a conservation easement, or that could be a property acquisition from somebody like Maryland Environmental Trust. And the money that they would gain from that transaction could allow them to purchase farmland elsewhere, which they could continue to farm. So in addition to actual property acquisition or property protection, we also are starting to work with farmers to think about alternative crops. Crops like barley and sorghum are more salt tolerant or tolerant of more marshy conditions.
More than corn and soybeans, or
that's correct.
Okay.
And honestly, I can't speak to the prevalence of those more salt-tolerant crops today, but that's definitely something that we're starting to think about. University of Maryland, Dr. Kate Tully is working a lot in this area to think about marsh migration and saltwater intrusion impacts on the Eastern Shore and how that's affecting the MERS.
Should people be going to what are some of the other organizations that people can take advantage of for their knowledge?
So organizations that are sort of working in the climate resilience realm right now, nonprofits on the Eastern Shore are Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, Shore Rivers, Chesapeake Bay Foundation. The Nature Conservancy is on the upper shore and the lower shore as well. Partners at the state level who we work with pretty regularly are the Department of Natural Resources, Maryland Department of the Environment, Maryland Emergency Management Agency. These folks are all starting to think about natural systems and open spaces, and also sort of emergency management and emergency planning as it relates to climate change. So I would encourage people sort of thinking from the emergency management perspective. We always talk about having a kit and being informed and being involved. Think about that from the climate perspective. Everybody has some level of risk, even if you don't live on the water. Changing rainfall patterns are going to disrupt transportation. They're going to disrupt stormwater infrastructure. These are things that affect our entire communities. And so people need to be thinking about their risk, not just today,
have a
but
backup
also
plan,
in the
like,
future.
for instance, with that wedding where they couldn't get the guests to the reception, right?
They were lucky they had a box truck to shuttle people back and forth.
Right.
So be thinking about alternative strategies for yourself, but have an awareness of the groups that are in your neighborhood or in your city or your area who are doing good work that you can support or stay informed with, and follow the trusted leaders in your community who are thinking about this and trying to help the community be as resilient as possible in the future.
Now, one of the things that I brought up prior to the interview, and I'm not sure how much it affects your specific area, the Eastern Shore, or if it's more coastal related, subsidizing beach replenishment projects that seem to be the norm with higher rent districts and less the norm in lower rent districts. But when you have a beach replenishment project in one of those higher rent districts, it does then impact the communities downstream, right?
Yeah.
So how do we deal with that going forward?
That's a great question, and you're right. That's not something that we deal with a whole lot in our area. But what I'll say is that in all aspects of climate adaptation, whether it's buyouts or subsidizing projects, we want to make sure that equity is a big piece, probably the biggest piece of all of the decision making that needs to be done. Not to say that someone is outright not deserving of financial assistance or resources when it comes to climate planning, but we need to make sure that all voices are heard, and we need to lift up the voices who are heard not quite as loudly in a traditional sense.
Okay, we're looking at the possibility, as we've been looking at for a very long time, for another Chesapeake Bay Bridge or another bay crossing, right? And the current governor says it's only going to happen at the same place we currently have another Chesapeake Bay, where we already have the bridge. Other people are like, why would you put more traffic right there? What area of the Eastern Shore would tolerate another bridge as far as coastal resilience? You're the guy.
So I am confident that the state is informed enough about sea level rise risks that they're not going to put a bridge that's going to terminate in some place like southern Dorchester County, which is going to be
gone,
very different from what it looks like today.
Gone? Is that
gone? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can talk about that. There are definitely parts of there are parts of a lot of different places on the Eastern Shore that aren't going to be here, are going to be underwater in 100 years. And I'm pretty sure the state is smart enough to not put a bridge terminus right there.
So Stevensville is not one of those places, probably.
Well, we'll see. One of the things that ESLC is advocating for in terms of the Bay Bridge conversation is not necessarily put it here as opposed to putting it there, but be thinking about holistic traffic management solutions and holistic environmental impacts or environmental solutions as it relates to transportation and the construction of a third span of the Bay Bridge.
Okay, here's the question you don't want to answer. What's your number one choice?
I'll say I'm very interested to see how this conversation unfolds within the next 6 months and year. And
is Kent County less precarious than Dorchester?
There's a lot of positives and negatives with each one. I certainly understand the argument that the governor's office is making for the proposed location that's consistent with the other two spans. But thinking about economic pluses and minuses, there are advantages and disadvantages.
What did you want to relay that I haven't relayed that is important for people to know, people that are listening on the shore, with how important these conservation easements are?
Conservation easements are very important, and property protection is very important, not just in terms of building the Delmarva Oasis that ESLC is leading, but just in terms of using natural systems as a method of flood protection. Because flood protection is going to be more and more important, more and more critical as sea level rises and we have increased flooding around the Chesapeake Bay on the Eastern Shore and the Western Shore.
Well, I can't thank you enough for being here today.
Thank you so much, Donna. This is great.
This is Donna Cole on the 1430 Connection. We'll see you next week.